Ask most people how the Second World War started, and you'll get the same answer. A madman took over Germany, and he dragged the world into the dark. And sure, that's part of it, but it's the last chapter of the story, not the first one. What almost never gets mentioned is the 20 years before that, the part built out of debt, interest payments, currency collapses, and boardroom deals signed in New York, London, and Paris. Long before a single German tank crossed into Poland, a small group of men were quietly building the conditions that made the whole catastrophe possible. So let's go back, not to 1939, to 1918, the moment the guns actually stopped. Europe in 1918 is a graveyard. 17 million people are dead, whole regions of France look like the surface of the moon, and into that wreckage steps a group of diplomats tasked with writing the peace. What they produce is the Treaty of Versailles, and most of us learned a simplified version of it in school. Germany got blamed, Germany got fined, Germany lost land. What we didn't learn is how that treaty accidentally built a financial trap with no real way out. Start with Article 231. One paragraph, forcing Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and every dollar of damage it caused. Historians have spent a century picking apart whether that's even true. Most serious scholars today will tell you the war's causes were tangled, alliances, arms races, miscalculation on every side, not one nation's guilt alone. None of that mattered in the room in 1919. The winners wanted someone to send the bill to, and the bill was enormous. The Allied Reparations Commission eventually landed on a figure of 132 billion gold marks. Economists at the time said the number wasn't just harsh. It was mathematically impossible to pay. One of the loudest voices saying so was a young British economist on the delegation, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes watched the negotiations up close, and what he saw disturbed him enough to resign and go write a book about it. That book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, argued the reparations would wreck Germany's economy, destabilize its politics, and put the whole European order at risk. His line has aged into a kind of prophecy: you can't squeeze blood from a stone, and trying anyway just breeds resentment. The book became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, and the people with the power to act on its warning mostly ignored it. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though. Versailles didn't just create a German problem. It created a debt loop that snared everyone. During the war, France and Britain had borrowed heavily from American banks, over $10 billion combined. Once the war ended, Washington wanted that money back. These were loans, not gifts, but France and Britain were broke themselves. Their one real option was to collect reparations from Germany and use that money to pay America back. So picture the loop. Germany pays France and Britain. France and Britain pay America. If Germany can't pay, the entire chain snaps. That wasn't a side effect of the post-war order. It was baked directly into it, and Germany genuinely couldn't pay. The treaty had already stripped away 13% of its territory, a big share of its farmland, a quarter of its coal, and most of its iron production. Its military was gutted, its merchant fleet confiscated. Ask yourself how a country in that position is supposed to generate the surplus needed to cover a debt that size. It couldn't, and the fallout from that failure arrived fast. By 1922, Germany had fallen behind on payments. France, still needing that money to cover its own American debt, ran out of patience. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial core, and occupied it outright, planning to seize the coal and steel directly. Germany's response was passive resistance. Workers walked off the job. Factories went quiet. And to keep supporting those strikers, the government did the one thing that always ends badly: it started printing money without restraint. That's the door into the Weimar hyperinflation, one of the most extreme currency collapses ever recorded. In January 1923, $1 bought around 17 zero marks. By November of that same year, $1 bought over 4 trillion marks. People carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread, and sometimes prices rose while they were still standing in line. A lifetime of savings could vanish in an afternoon. But here's the part worth sitting with. Hyperinflation didn't just wipe out money. It wiped out trust in institutions, in democracy, in the whole idea that tomorrow would resemble today. When everything you've built evaporates that fast, you don't just get angry. You go looking for someone to blame, and you start listening to whoever promises to make you whole again. That's the exact soil extremism needs to take root. And in Germany, in the early 1920s, that soil had just been tilled. Most retellings skip straight from here to Hitler's rise. But there's a whole chapter in between involving American bankers, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. By late 1923, even the Allied powers admitted the reparations system was broken. An international committee, led by American banker Charles Dawes, was assembled to restructure the whole thing. The Dawes Plan, adopted in 1924, reorganized Germany's central bank, introduced a new currency to replace the ruined one, set up a graduated payment schedule, and opened the door to a flood of American loans, and the money came. Between 1924 and 1929, American banks and investors poured an estimated $3 billion or more into Germany, well over $50 billion in today's terms. Roads got built, factories reopened, unemployment dropped. For a few years, it genuinely looked like the crisis had passed. Here's what almost nobody points out, though. That recovery wasn't built on German productivity. It was built on borrowed American money. Germany was using new loans to make its reparations payments, which means the loop from before just got a second layer. American banks lend to Germany, Germany pays France and Britain pay America back. And the whole cycle only keeps spinning as long as American investors keep writing checks. Keynes had warned about exactly this. A system entirely dependent on the continued willingness of one country's investors to keep lending isn't a system. It's a countdown. In 1929, the Dawes Plan gave way to the Young Plan, named for financier Owen Young. It cut Germany's total bill and stretched payments out over decades, and it created a new institution to manage it all, the Bank for International Settlements, based in Basel, Switzerland. We'll come back to the BIS because its story doesn't end with reparations. Keep that name in mind. For now, understand how fragile the whole arrangement had become by the late 1920s. Germany's recovery depended on American credit. France and Britain's debt payments depended on Germany. Global trade depended on everyone keeping their markets open. All three of those supports were about to get kicked out within about 18 months of each other. The first one to go was the American stock market. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed in the worst single-day panic in its history. American banks, suddenly staring at their own losses, started calling in loans from overseas. And the country that had borrowed the most was Germany. The flow of capital that had kept German industry running reversed almost overnight. Businesses lost their financing. Banks began failing. By 1932, roughly 6 million Germans, about a quarter of the workforce, were out of work, some on the edge of malnutrition. Then came a second blow, and this one was self-inflicted by Washington. In June 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods. It was meant to protect American industry. Instead, it triggered a global trade war. Canada, Britain, France, and Germany all retaliated with tariffs of their own. World trade, the engine that had powered the 1920s, went into freefall. Global trade volume dropped by roughly 2/3 within a few years. For Germany, already reeling from the withdrawn American loans, this was close to a knockout. Hunger, desperation, and fury spread fast. And political extremism didn't just grow in that environment, it exploded. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party barely registered, under 3% of the vote, dismissed as a fringe movement of cranks. By September 1930, in the thick of the economic collapse, they'd pulled over 6 million votes and become the second largest party in the Reichstag. 2 years later, in July 1932, they topped 13 million votes and became the largest party in the country. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor. That's usually where the standard story picks up. But it leaves out just how much of Hitler's rise, and Germany's rearmament afterward, was quietly financed from outside Germany's own borders. Which brings us to one of the most important, least talked about figures in this entire chain, H. Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a financial prodigy. He'd already saved Germany once, credited with taming the 1923 hyperinflation as a Reichsbank official. He had deep, personal relationships with bankers in New York and London, the kind of standing that opened doors at the Federal Reserve and at J.P. Morgan. In 1930, Schacht resigned from the Reichsbank and started cultivating ties with Germany's right wing, including the Nazi Party. He became one of the key figures persuading German industrialists and landowners to push President Hindenburg toward appointing Hitler Chancellor. Once Hitler was in power, Schacht was reinstalled as Reichsbank president and made Minister of Economics. He was, in every practical sense, the financial engineer of the new regime. In May 1933, just months into Hitler's rule, Schacht traveled to Washington and met with President Roosevelt and senior Wall Street bankers. According to several historical accounts, new American credit lines to Germany followed, reportedly in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Some estimates put the total nearer $1 billion, worth many times that today. That money arrived at precisely the moment the Nazi regime was consolidating power and starting to rearm. And it wasn't only bank credit. American corporations were woven directly into German industry. Consider IG Farben, the sprawling German chemical conglomerate that would later manufacture Zyklon B, the gas used in Nazi extermination camps. In 1929, IG Farben signed a sweeping cartel agreement with Standard Oil of New Jersey, the Rockefeller-controlled giant carving up the world market between petroleum and chemicals. Through that partnership, technology for producing synthetic fuel from coal and for tetrethyl lead, an additive critical to high-performance aviation engines, made its way into German hands. Without it, historians generally agree the Luftwaffe's aircraft engines would have been significantly weaker. Standard Oil also shared synthetic rubber technology with IG Farben, at a time when Germany had no natural rubber supply of its own, and no tanks, trucks, or aircraft that could run without it. List doesn't stop there. Ford Motor Company operated a plant in Cologne that built military trucks for the Wehrmacht. Henry Ford accepted a medal from the Nazi regime in 1938. General Electric's German affiliate kept financial ties active even after war broke out. ITT ran a German aircraft manufacturer that built fighter planes for the Luftwaffe throughout the war. DuPont held chemical and dye agreements with IG Farben. Researcher Anthony Sutton catalogued much of this in his book Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and it's worth flagging that Sutton's broader conclusions are considered overstated by many mainstream historians, even while the underlying corporate relationships he documented are well established in the historical record. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't mean. There's a real difference between corporations deliberately conspiring to enable a world war and corporations chasing profit in ways that had that effect anyway. Most historians land on the second explanation. These weren't boardrooms plotting global conquest. They were companies maximizing returns and protecting market share. But the outcome of those choices was real. They helped arm a regime that was openly preparing for conquest, whether that was the intention or not. Britain's hands aren't entirely clean here either. Montagu Norman, governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944, had a close working relationship with Schacht and the German banking world. In January 1932, a year before Hitler took power, Norman reportedly met with Hitler and Franz von Papen. What exactly was discussed is still debated by historians, but the meeting itself is documented, and it points to just how tangled European finance and German politics had become. Then there's appeasement, usually taught as simple naivety. Neville Chamberlain failing to see the monster in front of him. There's a financial layer under that story too. British banks were holding German bonds. British firms had deep trade ties to German companies. A war with Germany wouldn't just be a military disaster for Britain, it would wipe out a mountain of private wealth overnight. That's not the only reason Britain hesitated, but it's a reason that rarely makes it into the textbook version. Keynes's own book had an ironic afterlife here too, by convincing much of the British public that Germany had been wronged at Versailles. It created a well of sympathy that Hitler learned to draw from. Remilitarizing the Rhineland, absorbing Austria, claiming the Sudetenland, each looked, to plenty of ordinary British readers, less like conquest and more like a correction of old injustice. Now, back to that institution we set aside earlier, the Bank for International Settlements. Founded in 1930 to manage the Young Plan's payments, it was presented as a neutral, technical body for cooperation between central banks. Its founding members included the central banks of Belgium, France, Germany, Britain, Italy, and financial groups from Japan and the United States. But it was something more unusual than a clearinghouse. It operated under a charter granting it immunity from taxation and government interference, in peace and in war alike. A financial institution sitting almost entirely outside normal national oversight based in neutral Basel. And when the war started, the BIS didn't close. Under its American president, Thomas McKittrick, who led the bank through most of the war years, it continued doing business with the German Reichsbank, reportedly accepting gold that had been looted from occupied nations' central banks, and, by some accounts, gold stripped from Holocaust victims. At one point, gold reserves belonging to Czechoslovakia, which the Czech government had specifically moved to the Bank of England for safekeeping, were released to Nazi Germany at the BIS's instruction. A 1945 U.S. military government report documented the bank's ongoing relationship with the Reichsbank throughout the war. American Treasury Secretary Henry Morgan was disturbed enough by it to push for the bank's dissolution at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. A resolution passed calling for exactly that. It never happened. The BS survives today, still headquartered in Basel, still known informally as the Central Bank for Central Banks, still operating with legal protections most institutions could only dream of. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. This wasn't one man's madness. It was a chain, a punishing piece that bred resentment, a circular debt system that was unstable by design, credit that inflated a fake recovery and then vanished overnight, a trade war that turned a recession into a global depression, and corporations and bankers on both sides of the Atlantic who kept the machine running because the returns were good, right up until the machine turned into an army. None of this excuses what came next. Nothing excuses genocide, or a war of conquest, or the deliberate murder of millions of people. The people who ordered and carried out those crimes bear that responsibility fully, and no economic chart changes that. But if we tell this story as one man's evil and stop there, we miss the actual warning. We miss how ordinary financial decisions made by bankers, industrialists, and politicians who mostly weren't monsters can still build the road a monster ends up walking down. And that's the uncomfortable part, honestly. The pattern from the interwar years, crushing debt, tariff wars, financial power concentrated in institutions, nobody elected, corporations trading with anyone as long as the contract's good, hasn't vanished. It's just wearing different clothes now. The Post, war planners at Bretton Woods understood this. That's exactly why they built the IMF, the World Bank, and what eventually became global trade rules to stop beggar-the-neighbor policy from turning into another catastrophe. Those institutions only work as well as the political will behind them, and that will has been tested again and again since. Keynes saw the disaster coming in 1919 and got ignored because punishment was more popular than caution. The bankers kept lending through the 1920s because the returns were good, even as the whole structure looked unsustainable on paper. The industrialists kept signing contracts through the early 1930s because business was business. Almost everyone with a clear view of where this was heading chose short-term interest over long-term consequence. That, more than any treaty or any dictator alone, is the real starting point of the Second World War. So here's the actual lesson worth taking from all this. Hitler wasn't the cause. He was the outcome, a symptom of 2 decades of decisions made in boardrooms and treasury offices, long before he ever held real power. The diplomats at Versailles, the bankers on Wall Street, the industrialists chasing cartel profits, the central bankers who looked away, they each played a part, some carelessly, a few knowingly. Most just following incentives that felt reasonable at the time. That's the true origin of the Second World War. Not a single madman. A system that failed, one short-sighted decision at a time. If this changed how you think about where that war actually came from, stick around. There's a follow-up video on how the bank international settlements, wartime gold dealings were investigated after 1945, and why almost nobody was ever held accountable for it. Subscribe if you want more of the history that gets left out of the textbook version.